Miami, 2011. A federal judge stares down from the bench, gripping a signed confession. The man standing in court was once a Wall Street prodigy, then a prison inmate, then a pastor, then a national fraud investigator. Now he's here again. Barry Minkow, convicted, again. The courtroom is silent, but the air is heavy with a single question. How does someone fool the world twice? Not just investors or banks, but parishioners, friends, the FBI. He didn't just run one of the biggest Ponzi schemes of the 1980s. He came back from prison and did it all over again. This is not the story of a man who lost his way. This is the story of a man who perfected the con. Barry Minkow's story began in a suburban garage in Reseda, California. At just 16 years old, he launched a carpet cleaning business called Z-Best. He had a mop, a phone, an ambition far bigger than the square footage of his parents' house. But ambition doesn't pay for ads, phones, or trucks. So Minkow forged checks, ran up fraudulent credit card charges. He even took a high-interest loan from a man who claimed ties to the mob, an 18-year-old diving headfirst into a life of deception. Soon, Barry realized something else. It was easier to fake success than to earn it. By fabricating massive insurance restoration jobs like rebuilding homes after fictional fires, he convinced investors that Z-Best was thriving. He staged fake construction sites, forged hundreds of pages of documentation. Auditors walked through phony job sites that were more Hollywood set than business operation. And it worked. In January 1986, Barry Minkow took Z-Best public. He was just 19. Overnight, he became one of the youngest CEOs of a publicly traded company in American history. By early 1987, his stock valuation surpassed $200 million. Minkow himself was worth over $100 million, on paper at least. He bought a mansion, drove a red Ferrari with Z on the license plate, held meetings surrounded by motivational posters that said things like, "My act is clean, how's yours?" He was hailed as the next great American entrepreneur. Charismatic, brash, magnetic, a media darling. But the fiction had an expiration date. On May 22, 1987, the Los Angeles Times published a damning article about Barry's early run-ins with fraud. The market panicked. Z-Best stock plummeted. Creditors pulled out. And in less than 2 months, the entire company crumbled. The teenager who once grinned from magazine covers now sat across from FBI agents. The house of cards had collapsed. In 1988, a federal grand jury indicted Barry Minkow on 54 counts of racketeering, conspiracy, and securities fraud. It turned out that almost 90% of Z-Best's revenue had been fabricated. Investors were out $26 million. The trial was swift. Barry tried to blame organized crime, but the jury didn't buy it. He was convicted on all counts. At 22 years old, he was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. But this wasn't the end of his story. Behind bars, Minkow claimed to find God. He became a born-again Christian, earned a degree in biblical studies, and started expressing public remorse. He was released in 1995 after serving just over 7 years. He was 29. And somehow, the world gave him another chance. Barry became a pastor, a fraud investigator. He co-founded the Fraud Discovery Institute, where he used his knowledge of scams to expose other scammers. He even worked with the FBI. A convicted con man had become a crime fighter. The media loved it. CBS's 60 Minutes featured him. Business magazines profiled his transformation. This time, he was the reformed man warning others. He claimed to have helped uncover over $1 billion in fraud. And for a while, it seemed like maybe, just maybe, this was a story of redemption. But there were shadows creeping in. While Minkow investigated companies, he also shorted their stocks, betting they would fall after his reports were released. He said it wasn't unethical, that he was just using his knowledge to expose fraud and profit from it. In 2009, Barry accused a major home builder, Lennar Corporation, of cooking its books. Lennar's stock tanked, but it wasn't truth that brought it down. It was fiction. Minkow had lied, fabricated evidence, lied under oath. A Florida judge declared that Minkow had committed a fraud on the court. In 2011, Barry Minkow pleaded guilty to insider trading and securities fraud. He stepped down from his church, telling his congregation he was no longer fit to lead. He was sentenced to 5 years, but the unraveling wasn't over. It turned out that for a decade, while leading services, baptizing children, and counseling marriages, Barry Minkow had been stealing from his own congregation. He embezzled over $3 million from his church, including one donation from a grieving widower for a fake hospital in Sudan. He was charged again. In 2014, Barry pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit bank fraud and wire fraud. A second federal judge sentenced him to 5 more years in prison. Barry Minkow once again went to jail. By the time he was released in 2019, he was in his early 50s, broke, and owing hundreds of millions of dollars in restitution. The boy who promised the world a new kind of business empire had become a cautionary tale twice. He had stood at the altar and at the courthouse, preached truth and practiced lies, helped expose fraud while quietly committing it. So what do we make of Barry Minkow? Is he a villain who wore a pastor's robe to disguise his greed? A genius undone by his own compulsions? Or a symbol of how intoxicating power and praise can be? Minkow once said he was addicted, not to money, but to the feeling of astonishing people, of being seen. Maybe that's the real story here. Not just of fraud, but of the human craving to be admired, to be believed, to be forgiven. Barry Minkow didn't just scam investors, he scammed a nation's desire to believe in second chances. And perhaps in the end, that's the most devastating con of all.